So, welcome everybody. My name is Tara Haelle. I am the Health Beat Leader on Infectious Disease for AHCJ. This webinar is one of a series of topic-specific training opportunities to brief health journalists on the latest information in a particular health area and to give you story ideas or resources you can use in your work. Today's topic is Make Facts Matter Again, pushing back against misinformation and disinformation, something I know that is deeply important to everybody who is filtering into the room right now. Joining us today will be Professor Stephan Lewandowsky, a cognitive scientist at the University of Bristol who has spent his career studying how misinformation originates and spreads and why people believe it. Professor Lewandowsky is the co-creator of the Debunking Handbook and multiple other resources for pushing back against misinformation on topics ranging from climate change to vaccines. And today we'll hear his thoughts on the current misinformation and disinformation environment, including many of the narratives about health that currently mislead people and how to address them. After Steve presents, we will have a Q&A. You can ask questions at any time, including during the presentation. We will start those during the Q&A period. Please put your questions in by using the Q&A space. That's at the bottom of the Zoom where the question mark is. Do not put them into the comments, as I will be looking at the Q&A space. So we will go ahead and get started. Steve, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thanks so much. I hope you can see my screen now. Yeah, I want to focus mainly on health misinformation today, but I can't do that without looking at the global context. And one of the things that has been concerning me and my colleagues and many other people is that for the last 10 to 20 years, democracy worldwide has been in retreat. What you see here is a graph that is comparing 2012 to 2022. And the only thing you have to know is that any point below the line has suffered democratic backsliding, a reduction in democracy as measured by numerous indicators. And that includes the United States. And it's anybody's guess where that point is heading now. This was in 2022. So that is the background, the context, and the question is why? Well, there's 100 answers to this. We can talk about this for hours, but interestingly, misinformation and disinformation has been cited as a top risk by the World Economic Forum that came out last year, about a year ago. For the next 2 years, the World Economic Forum, based on an extensive expert survey of risk analysts, is saying, well, this is the biggest problem we have to deal with. And I have been working in a number of domains, including the health domain, and I want to focus mainly on the health domain, picking out one particular issue where, the reality is fairly clear, and that is that the COVID-19 vaccines have saved, millions of lives, 1.4 million in the European region, according to the WHO. And basically, without the vaccines, we would have not made it out of the pandemic. But of course, that hasn't stopped misinformation from being awash on the internet, being pushed by certain people who, by the way, are making a lot of money out of this. You can monetize misinformation, unfortunately. And I want to briefly tell you about one project I was involved in that was commissioned by the Canadian government, and that was conducted by the Canadian Council of Academies. And what we did in this project was to create a model that combined the epidemiology with the infodemiology. So we had agents in this model who could get infected, who could die from COVID, or who might recover from COVID. And the probability of being infected was related to their vaccination status. And their vaccination status, in turn, was related to their opinions. And we estimated their opinions based on surveys of the Canadian population to include sometimes misinformation that would stop them from being vaccinated. So what can we do with this sort of model? Well, one thing we can do to make sure that it works or is meaningful is to first show that it can capture what actually happened. And yes, we can do that. And that is what we're calling the baseline number, which is what was observed in Canada alone. This is only for Canada, making use of Canadian population data. And the headline result of the modeling is that if you take the exact same model, but you make the assumption that there's less misinformation out there, or no misinformation, or people are not affected by the misinformation, then you save, in this case, about 3,000 lives and I think hundreds of millions of dollars in medical expenses. So the bottom line is misinformation can kill and it costs a lot of money. And there's enough evidence for me to be very concerned about that. In particular, if you combine misinformation with the emergence of what most people now are fearing will be an autocracy in the United States, where all sorts of things are happening affecting science that are not normal. So, for example, there was an editorial in The Lancet a few weeks ago where they said, hey, you know, climate science is disappearing. And it is indeed the case that, you know, climate science is increasingly difficult to find on government websites, and all sorts of agencies are shut down or people are fired. And, you know, I have a lot of friends in the climate community, and they're telling me that, you know, the weather forecast you're used to, well, you're not going to get it too much longer if this continues because there are essential components being taken out. And there is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who is well known for his not just anti-vaccination views, but also for holding other fairly exotic beliefs that are not supported by evidence, to put it mildly, so that HIV doesn't cause AIDS, according to R.F. Kennedy. COVID-19 was somehow ethnically targeted because it's bioengineered, whatever, and Wi-Fi causes a leaky brain, whatever that is. You know, there's that is, of course, very concerning. So that's the context that I wanted to sketch out for starters. And so now the question is, how do we respond to that? Now, of course, the main response to all of this has to be political and structural, whether you like it or not. We or you as individuals can do very little, but we can do something. And what I want to do today is to highlight these 6 issues that deal with things that we can do, that you as a professional, as a journalist, for example, can be aware of, might help you in thinking about what's going on out there, and it might help you to help everybody else, help society in combating misinformation. So let me go through these 6 points. And my goal has been to be fairly hands-on rather than deeply theoretical from a psychological or cognitive point of view, but I will nonetheless talk about underlying theory because I think it is necessary to do that. The first point I want to make is that we all need to have a commitment to the existence of facts. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that Belgium did not invade Germany in 1914. Neither did Poland invade Germany in 1939. Neither did Ukraine invade Russia a few years ago. Now, those are facts. And we have to commit ourselves to the existence of those facts. Because if we don't, then we have no way of meeting the challenges that arise when somebody is flipping that around and is blaming the victim for starting a war. Now, this is an extreme case, but it is not an isolated case. And there is quite a growing number of voices in public discourse who basically are saying, the world is too complicated. We can't know what's true or false. Okay? Well, actually, no, that's nonsense. There are things that are so complicated that it's difficult to get to the truth, but that doesn't license people to lie. It's as simple as that. Whether we can agree on what the inflation rate is or some complicated issue, that has no bearing on somebody making stuff up or claiming that Belgium is responsible for World War I. Now, here's a paper where my colleagues and I analyzed that in depth. Here's another one, a commentary. It just came out about a month ago in Science, where I regularly post a column on these issues. And one of the things that I want to highlight from that particular piece is that fact-checking is free speech. It is not censorship, notwithstanding what some politicians, for their own reasons, are trying to make the public believe. No one is being censored if a politician is being held accountable by being corrected. Fact-checking is free speech. I think that is an extremely important point to make. It's a kind of point I don't think I should have to make. And, 20 years ago wouldn't have been an issue. But we live in times where a lot of things that we should take for granted, we have to actually fight for. So that was my first point. The second point about misinformation is the following conundrum. Donald Trump, during his first presidency, made more than 30,000 false or misleading claims. That's sort of an hour, I worked out, almost 24/7 for the whole period of his presidency. So he was very busy saying things that weren't true. But here's the surprising accompanying result. Throughout his presidency, about 3/4 of his voters considered Trump to be honest. And they still do. People think Donald Trump is honest. People who support Donald Trump very often say that. Oh, he's honest. Now, how can that be? Now, this is something we have to understand because no fact-checking and no countermeasures, no fighting back will find any traction unless we understand what's going on. Now, what I think is going on, based on work by myself and colleagues, is that we're confronted with two different subjective notions of truth or honesty. By that, I mean that the way people think about honesty and truth is very different. There's one aspect of truth that relies on authenticity and sincerity. That is, if somebody sincerely says, I really believe the earth is flat, then they're honest by that criterion. Now, they're wrong because the earth isn't flat, but they're honest. Now, that is an intuition-based approach to honesty and truth that is entwined with populist politics and indeed has deep roots in fascism in the 1930s. Now, in opposition to that, there is a view of truth and honesty that doesn't really care about how sincere you are. What that cares about is whether you are in connection, in contact with reality. Are you capturing reality? Are you, speaking the truth about the world? Is it evidence? Now, those are completely different notions of truth or honesty. And most people, certainly in the scientific community, are subscribing to the second version of truth. Fact checkers do. Most journalists, in my opinion, do. Politicians used to at least pay lip service to that idea. But certain politicians who are populists or fascists, if you want, they don't care about evidence. They have convinced people that what matters is their authenticity and sincerity. They appear honest to their followers even when they lie, and the followers, the voters, don't care. And that is a situation where fact-checking becomes incredibly difficult because, as I just said, they really don't care. Oh, Donald Trump was wrong. Yeah, okay, fine. I don't care. He's an honest guy. He says it as it is. We have a lot of experiments and data showing that that is precisely how people respond to corrections of Donald Trump. So, what can you do? Well, it's not easy, but I have a number of experiments in the pipeline with a PhD student, getting hopefully close to publication, where what we did was to instruct people, and when I say people, I mean randomly chosen participants in an experiment representative of the American population, so bipartisan and all that. And we tell them what they should think of as truth. And of course, we compare different conditions, but the one I want to focus on is the one where you tell people, look, to be truthful, you got to stick to facts. Being sincere is not enough. This is a short bit here. We actually go on for this at length and we hammer it home, make sure people understand this. And then we present them with scenarios, political scenarios, and ask them to tell us how they feel about the politicians involved. And what we find is that if you nudge people towards an accuracy and evidence-based notion of truth without saying anything else, there's no fact checking here, just this basic nudge, think of honesty as, being evidence-based, people become less tolerant of dishonest politicians. This whole gig that you can be honest while you're lying, well, that doesn't work too well if you tell people that they should focus on evidence. And we've shown this over and over again. Now, how do you translate that into reality? Well, it's a tough question. I don't know, but it is promising that you can prime or nudge people to get off the sincerity train, which is what populist politicians around the world are basically riding. They're saying, oh, I represent the true people and I really feel for you and all that. And then they say things that is completely bizarre and off the wall. Well, the reason they get away with it is because people feel, oh, yeah, he's honest. And if you can switch that over to an evidence-based approach, that whole approach doesn't work too well anymore. So that's one problem with not a solution, but at least I can tell you something that has helped in our experiments. Here's another one, and that is a very fundamental problem. And since I'm an academic, I have to show faces of philosophers from a few hundred years ago. We have Spinoza on the right and Descartes. No. Spinoza's on the left, and Descartes is on the right. The one on the left is competing in a beauty contest. The one on the right, probably not. Why are these two old dudes relevant? They're relevant because they have very different views of how people form beliefs. And if you think about believing things, it is actually a fascinating idea because how does it work? What if somebody tells you the earth is flat? Do you instantly believe that, even though you know it's false? Or do you look at it as Descartes was saying, oh, yeah, people examine the truth status, and then if it's true, they form a belief, and if it's false, then they say no. Okay, now that's a totally rational thing to do, isn't it? I mean, it's like that's how a computer would operate, probably, if I had to program. Now, Spinoza, on the other hand, said, oh, whatever you hear, it doesn't matter. You first form a belief. And then if you're lucky, you might attach a little label to it that says, oh, it's false. A little red flag that says, hello, actually, this belief is false. Now, there is a preponderance of evidence to suggest that Spinoza got it right, that when we hear things, we believe it. We believe it even if we know it's false. Let me show you some data that underscores that, because that is one of the difficulties of dealing with misinformation before you get to politics and populism and all that. It is the simple cognitive phenomenon that if you present people with statements that are true or false, here are some examples. Green is true, red is false, in case you couldn't tell. And you show people these statements over and over again. You repeat them over and over again. And you ask people for a truth rating. Now, what you find is two things. Number one, thank goodness, the false stuff is rated lower than the true stuff on average. But look at what happens here. If you repeat things 15 times, then even false things are considered to be as true as a true item on its first presentation. You can eradicate the advantage of truth by repeating the falsehood 15 times. That's what this means. That's what these data mean. They have been replicated many times, including with statements such as the Atlantic Ocean is the largest ocean on Earth, which are false, and which people know are false. But if you repeat it 15 times over, then they're less certain in their commitment to the falsehood. This is known as the illusory truth effect. And if you ever wonder why some politicians only ever say one thing over and over again, even though it's false, well, the answer is right here. They know that repetition means truth. Repetition, 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 anything, eventually it'll be considered to be true. That's a basic cognitive phenomenon that is extremely difficult to sidestep. Another consequence of how we form beliefs is that misinformation sticks. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that if you hear something crazy like this, the Pope endorses Donald Trump. He didn't in 2016, but it was reported that he did. And then, the fact checkers the next day say, whoa, 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 that's rubbish. He never did. Then what happens is that people, in many circumstances, still continue to believe the false information. We call that the continued influence effect. And it refers to the fact that people rely on information they're told is false. And not only that, that they acknowledge as being false. People very often say, oh, yeah, okay, so the Pope didn't endorse Trump. Fine, thanks for telling me. Now I know. Okay. And 5 seconds later, if you ask them, well, how many Catholics are going to vote for Donald Trump? Well, they're going to say, oh, almost all of them, whatever, a high number, because the Pope endorsed Donald Trump. And this, again, is not because people are trying to be sort of weird or trying to play games or anything. This is a basic cognitive principle that it is extremely difficult to correct information in memory, because if you just say that's false, you're kind of left with a hole in your mental life, because it's very difficult to rip things out if you learn that they're false. What you have to do instead, and this is one of the things we can talk about later, is that you got to replace the false information with something true, rather than just saying that was false. You got to replace it with something true or an alternative explanation. You got to tell people, yeah, you know what? It was a bunch of Macedonian teenagers that made up that fake news. And then people say, oh, okay, maybe I really shouldn't believe that. But those are the difficulties, basic cognitive difficulties that arise from misinformation and repetition of false information, because we're built that way. So what do we do? All right. Well, there's a whole toolbox of countermeasures, and we have a paper that came out last year where we're summarizing that entire toolbox of interventions. Here is an excerpt from the table of interventions. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm not going to explain all that. There's a lot of fine print here, and if you want to know that, you can just Google the toolbox, or I can circulate the links later, and you can read it yourself. However, I do want to tell you about one study that we've conducted that is now forthcoming. It's a mega study. That means we recruited 32,000 participants or more. And we looked at a lot of the countermeasures that are in the toolbox, and we compared them against each other. Now, this graph is complicated, but it's actually pretty easy to read. You can see there are two vertical dashed lines. Anything that straddles the line means didn't have an effect. Anything that is to the left of the line is good, because that means people improved because of the intervention. And that's on the left, accuracy. On the right, it is sharing. There are two distinct measures. We can either ask people, is this headline, including medical headlines in this case, is this accurate or not? Or we can ask them, do you want to share this with your friends on Facebook? Two different questions. Important to keep them separate. But what you can see is here that the overwhelming result for all interventions, with some exceptions, is that they were effective. People share less false information or misleading information after our interventions in comparison to a control. And they're getting better at accuracy discernment in comparison to a control. So that's the overall pattern. Now, that tells you nothing about the details. So what I'm going to do to tell you about the details is to focus on one intervention, namely inoculation. What is inoculation? Let's talk about inoculation a little while, because it is actually quite a powerful technique, and I've done a lot of work on that. Now, inoculation refers to an intervention where we first tell people, ooh, hang on, be careful, you might be misled. Okay, step one, a warning, gets them alert. They wake up and sort of say, oh, okay, I better have a look. Then we explain a misleading talking point, misleading rhetoric to people. It turns out that misinformation, misleading rhetoric has fingerprints. They're not perfect, but they're pretty good. We have pretty good cues of the quality of information without knowing what is being said, whether it's about vaccinations or climate change or whatever, it doesn't matter. The fingerprint transcends the content. And in a nutshell, what happens is that people become much better at discerning between high and low quality information after you inoculate them. We have shown this multiple times, including in the field using a YouTube experiment. Now I'm going to skip over the video because I want to leave time for questions. Otherwise, I would have shown you a video that teaches people not to be misled by highly emotional material, but I think you can imagine how that might work. In this YouTube experiment I want to tell you about, nearly 1 million people watched that video that explained to them how they might be misled by people being hyper emotional and evoking outrage, which is one of the fingerprints of misinformation. And then within 24 hours later, people were shown these test items where they had to identify a misleading technique that was or was not present in this test item. Now, we got 22,000 responses, half of them in a control, the other half, following the inoculation video. So, a huge number of people. And here are the data. Again, there's a vertical line. That would mean nothing happened. And then anything to the right in this instance means, aha, people got better at detecting misinformation. And as you can see across different items, different videos, on average, there is an effect. People get better, even in situations where they don't even know they're in an experiment. They're up on YouTube and they have to listen to our video because otherwise they don't get to the main video. On YouTube, you have to listen to the ad. Well, we had an ad that was our video. Now, this wasn't the only case in which something worked in the field. Google did a large number of studies in Eastern Europe, in India, and in Germany. I think this was last year, the year before, just before the European elections. Again, with videos that were explaining to people these three different types of misleading argumentation. They managed to reach more than half of all YouTube users in the country, more than half of all Facebook users. So we're talking about a very big study here. And guess what? In all cases, for these three different techniques of misleading argumentation, they got a fairly substantial boost in people's ability to recognize when they were being manipulated. So teaching people something about manipulative language ahead of time protects them against being misled. That's what inoculation means, and we've done this many times over. Now, you might think 6%, 5 or 6% increase in performance, and is that really worth it? Well, all of the effects I'm talking about here are small, but that doesn't mean they're not significant or relevant in the real world. Now, let me show you why I think that's the case. This is another modeling study done by a colleague of mine, Joe Back-Coleman and colleagues. They did a similar thing to our Canadian study at the outset. They took an epidemiological model of how viruses spread. They used that to model misinformation for 454 observed events of false news during the 2020 election. Their simulation closely resembled what actually happened. So exactly the same approach as what we used in the Canadian study. And then they played with the model and said, well, I wonder what would happen if, if I did this, X, Y, Z. Very interesting stuff. I'll show you one result. And this result at the top is showing you the baseline. That is the number of times misinformation was posted online, and that is what was observed in reality, and that's more than 11 million times. And they then simulated the effect of nudging people, that is inoculating a segment of the population against sharing, which is precisely what we did in our experiments. So they said, okay, well, let's suppose you can inoculate 5% of the population. What happens to the number of posts? Well, they go down. What about if we do 10%? You're down to 8 million from 11. That's a big difference. If you reach 40% of the population, what are you down to? Just barely over 4 million. In other words, little nudges that keep people from spreading something can accumulate and have an effect because it's interrupting these viral cascades that are otherwise permeating the internet. So that's kind of good to know that even small effects can add up. So just to summarize, this is only one intervention out of the toolbox, but it has been extensively examined. And we have used inoculation against a lot of different materials, including potentially radicalizing material in the context of Islamist or Islamophobic material, radicalizing extremist material. We can inoculate people against that. It appears to work in the real world. By the time you're talking about 45 million YouTube views, that's the real world. That's no longer a lab experiment. The effect sizes are modest, but as the last simulation showed, they can scale up and make a difference to the population. Now, the last point I want to make before we turn to questions is that not all communication involves countering misinformation or disinformation, especially if you're a journalist. I mean, you're not always debunking things. You actually want to, talk about things and set your own frame. Now, one successful approach that you can use is what I call consensus communication. And that has been shown widely, including in one experiment in the medical domain in the field, which I'll tell you about in a moment. First, a hypothetical question, a thought experiment. Would you eat these oysters? If I told you that 97 out of 100 microbiologists recommend against eating them because they're contaminated. 2 out of 100 microbiologists, I'm sure, and there's one guy who says, yeah, they're safe. Okay. RFK's cousin, something. Would you eat these oysters? Well, I wouldn't, and most people wouldn't. And that makes perfect sense. And we have explored the effects of such messages in a variety of domains. Let me first tell you about climate change. There are 3 propositions in climate science: that the climate is changing, that humans are causing it, and it's sort of a problem because it's not going to be benign. Those 3 fundamentals are endorsed by over 97% of the literature, over 97% of scientists. If you ask them, there's some debate about whether it's 97.5 or 99. You know, it really doesn't matter. It's an incredibly strong consensus. No matter what sort of fabricated debate you might see on Fox News, if you go to, the scientific conferences, there is no debate about climate change because it's a fact of life. Same way that HIV causes AIDS. It's a fact of life. Don't debate that. Now, what should we draw? What conclusion is legitimate to draw from these data, from the fact that there is a consensus? And this, I think, is important to point out because, you always get people who say, oh, well, science isn't done by majority vote. It's done on the basis of evidence. It's kind of like, yeah, I know. But if everybody agrees on the evidence, we call that a consensus. And that is a very strong signal of of scientific knowledge. And according to philosophers, here's one of them, it is quite justified for me to defer to a consensus if those 3 things are true. Social calibration, meaning all the scientists have the same idea of what evidence is. There aren't people in there who read tea leaves or something. Everybody is saying, yeah, okay, you got to measure temperature. There has to be a consilience of evidence. Things have to converge on the same conclusion. And the consensus has to be socially diverse because you want to make sure that this isn't, white males forming a consensus. We've had that in the past with disastrous results when it comes to IQ and race and those things. So it's got to be socially diverse. Now, in the case of climate change, all of those criteria are met. And they're also met in the case of vaccination, in the case of HIV causing AIDS, and the list goes on. I mean, science isn't entirely useless, to put it mildly. Scientists do agree and know things. This is weird that I have to say this, but I do have to say it because in public, very often I talk to people and I get the sense that the only thing they know about science is that it's uncertain. I'm like, have you ever used an iPhone? Why do you think that works if science is uncertain? Well, here are good reasons when you should trust the consensus. Now, people know this intuitively. Here's one study. I'll show you the data in a moment. This is one of mine from quite some time ago, one of the first ones to show this, that if you tell people about the scientific consensus, their acceptance of the science of climate change increases. And what is particularly interesting is that it goes up more for people who are firm believers in the free market, in other words, libertarians, who normally in the control condition are more predisposed to reject the evidence from climate science. So for them in particular, being told about the consensus gives them a boost and puts them in a better position vis-a-vis the scientific evidence. Now let me tell you about vaccinations, because we're talking about medical medical context. This is a great study. It was done some years ago during the pandemic as the COVID-19 vaccines were being rolled out. It was done in the Czech Republic. And they started out by measuring the consensus among doctors. So they got 10,000 doctors in the Czech Republic, surveyed them, and asked them about, do you trust the vaccines? Do you want to be vaccinated? And 90% of them said yes. Yes, I trust the vaccines, and yeah, I can't wait to have it. Now, then at the same time, they did a survey of the public and found that only half of the public, that the public thought only half the doctors would trust the vaccines. That's very common. The public very often feels 50-50, with climate change. If you ask the public, very often you get the sort of, 50-50. No, it's 97%. And here it was 90%. So question now, what if you tell people? What if you take actual patients who visit a doctor, you randomize them into a control or a consensus intervention, you then take time to measure the uptake over time, there are repeated opportunities to get vaccinated, and during the intervention, you provide patients with multiple slides with information about the consensus. For example, what I just said, 90% of doctors trust the vaccine, and a lot of them have already been vaccinated, and the others who hadn't been were waiting for it. So that was the intervention. It was done over and over again. It was a strong kind of like, do you really get this? And what happened to uptake? Well, what happened to uptake is that the people in the intervention condition who got the consensus message over time got vaccinated more than the people in the control condition. What you're seeing here, anything above that 0 horizontal line, is an advantage of the consensus condition over the control. So these aren't absolute numbers, they're differences. Now, anything above, significantly above, means that the intervention had an effect. And there's a lot of different ways to do the statistics. Hence, there's so many dots, but you really don't have to count the dots. You just got to realize, well, yeah, there's an effect because they're all above the 0 line for the most part after some time. So that tells us that consensus messages do work. And they've been shown to work in vaccination multiple times, climate change multiple times, and can't remember what else. I'm sure somebody has done it somewhere else. But GMO, that's another controversial thing where people think scientists don't agree. GMO is a little trickier because it's a little fuzzier. What is actually meant by that, but the intervention works. And now, to wrap up almost, I have published a whole bunch of, I think Tara mentioned the Debunking Handbook, didn't you, when you introduced me? Well, here it is. It's available in something like 15 languages. So is the Conspiracy Theory Handbook and various other handbooks. And if you scan that QR code, then you get taken to my resource page, which has a lot of public-facing information about how to debunk, pre-bunk, inoculation, more on the role of technology and all this, algorithms, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yes, I hope that was useful and you find that useful if you go there. And with that, I will thank you for your attention and I look forward to your questions.
And I did put the link to that in the chat as well. Someone asked right at the beginning, the intuition and the evidence-based approaches, can you combine them, like start with sincerity and then back it up with evidence?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, and I should have mentioned that. Both of these components of honesty are legitimate aspects of what it means to be honest. Okay. And I hate to use a specific example, but one of the things about Hillary Clinton was that during the campaign, she actually was remarkably accurate if you ask the fact checkers. But people never perceived her as sincere because she used this complicated professional politician language that was kind of this and that. On the other hand, that, very polished, very kind of professional, but she lost out on the sincerity dimension.
Sounds like it's like the cerebral versus the plain talking kind of thing.
Exactly. Now, on the other hand, that and I think it is legitimate to ask that somebody should be sincere. I don't like talking to robots and spin doctors. I'd rather have somebody gives me a straight answer. But just because they're giving me a straight answer, they also have to be right. So there is a blend there, and it's just to expand on this a little. I almost put the slides in, but then I thought I'd run out of time. We have a paper about to come out where we looked at the balance between evidence-based and intuition-based language in the US Congress over 150 years or something since the middle of the 19th century. And we find that there's been a shift from evidence to intuition starting in the 1970s, mid 1970s, a dramatic shift from evidence-based language to intuition-based language. And that was particularly accentuated in the last few years. Now, the problem with that is that we were also able to show that the performance of Congress declines the more the language used in Congress is intuitive rather than evidence-based. So if you just rely on intuition and sincerity, you don't get anything done in politics. That's what the data show. For Congress to be productive, it has to use evidence-based language. And it also affects polarization and lots of other things. But so if you shift the balance too far towards sincerity, then there's a lot of stuff happens that's not so good.
We have a lot of questions here. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to skip around a bit. Where
Sure.
does gaslighting fall into this? You have politicians who are very good at convincing people they didn't see or hear. I think of the famous 1984, quote, the party told you not to believe your eyes and ears. So how do journalists combat that since facts and evidence don't seem to sway some people?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I mean, Donald Trump has said that. I used that quote in one of my chapters. He said basically, don't trust your eyes, listen to me, effectively. Well, it's extremely difficult to deal with that. What you have to do is to try and get people out of the whole paradigm where sincerity overrides accuracy. And I think from what we have done, it is possible to do that. And I would do it by saying, well, hang on, guys, yeah, straight talking is really important. I'm a straight shooter too. I'm sincere in my beliefs. But you know what? I'm also right. And then you can sort of say, you can make it clear that being sincere is not an excuse for lying to people. I think that is a really important point to make because no one really likes being lied to.
Does it matter how long someone has held a particular misinformed belief? And I'm going to combine this question with another one, which is, does it matter where the source comes from? Those are two different people's questions, but how much does
Yeah.
the source matter, like a friend or versus a news story versus a politician, and how long the person has held that belief?
Well, obviously, the longer you've held a belief, the more likely it is to be strong because you don't hold a weak belief for long. Okay. If I have some belief about the color of a tree in my garden out there, or whatever, there's a flower and I'm not sure whether it's pink or purple, I'm going to forget about that and won't hold that belief for long unless I'm vested in this and I'm saying, yeah, I bought that rose and it was purple and then I'll believe it forever. And so if I hold the belief for long, chances are it's going to be a strong belief. And the stronger a belief is, the harder it is to dislodge. Now, That's particularly true and problematic in the health domain, because a lot of people hold beliefs very strongly. For example, that vaccinations are unsafe or bad for them. Okay. So, what do you do in that situation? Now, we have a whole project called JitsuVax. You can look that up, Google it, where we've, for the last 4 years, have tried to kind of find a way to talk to people like that. And you can. And the answer is the crucial thing is 3 steps. Number one, you got to understand where they're coming from. We call that attitude roots. So, do they have a religion? Do they have a worldview, an ideology? Are they fearful? Are they conspiracy theorists? You got to understand where they're coming from. That's step one. Step two, you then work with that and not against it. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that you take that underlying attitude root and you affirm it. You empathize with the person. You say, "Oh, you're afraid of side effects." And you say, "You know what? I totally understand that. I think fear is a basic human response to uncertainty, and it's a very good thing to be fearful." You can go on about the lions in the savannah that were hunting our ancestors. It's a good thing. And then you do the third thing. And the third thing is that you then pivot from endorsing their basic attitudes to saying, but you know what? In this particular case, great news, you don't have to be afraid because, in fact, the vaccine is safe. If you say that up front, people shut the door. If you say, hey, yeah, I know where you're coming from, you endorse as much as you can that underlying attitude, then you have a space for conversation. And we have data showing that really increases uptake. We have done a field study in Romania where we trained physicians in this technique. One group was trained, the other group wasn't. They did their own thing. And the people who were trained in our technique got a vastly higher uptake. An actual, people making appointments to get vaccinated. It's like a real, measure. And so we have a lot of evidence suggesting that works. Now, you can't do that as a journalist because you're not actually interacting uh, um, with people. Oh yeah, and Catherine Haelle, yeah, she's fantastic. She's married to a pastor and knows how to talk to religious people in Texas, which is where she lives. So yeah, but that works. You get yeah, she's Canadian, I know, but she lives in Texas. I know her quite well. So yeah, so you can do that, but you have to have a conversation to do this. You can't just sort of blast it out on the internet.
I do a lot of talks in the past on change people's minds with vaccination. I want to put a plug in for people to check out motivational interviewing because that's a way in which you can do
Precisely.
exactly where you try and figure out what their values are, the underlying value that informs their belief, and then you ask them questions in such a way that
Yes.
orients them toward making a choice that actually orients with
Yeah.
both the evidence and their values. Um,
Yes.
so there's some great resources out there. I'll include in a tip sheet that I'll put together on learning how to do motivational interviewing. Um,
Yeah. We work with the people who, developed a motivational interview. We sort of incorporate an aspect of it through the
right.
affirmation, but then we go beyond it and we have this rebuttal stage because you've got to get, you got to get rid of the misconception somehow.
Right, right.
You can't just
Um,
say, yeah, that's all good. You
have
have,
you studied Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to I want to get through as many of these as I can.
of
Have
course,
you studied
yeah.
the impacts of specific types of storytelling on misinformation? I know stories can be really powerful and sort of tapping into people's
Yeah.
emotions, but is like data stories versus human interest case studies versus political stories. Like, since journalists are in the storytelling business, are there certain stories that have a bigger impact on cutting through the misinformation?
Yeah. Well, first of all, stories probably work better than data. Okay. Some with most people, there's some people who prefer data. I want data, but I'm a scientist, and few people are like me in that regard. But I can't. tell you whether one narrative is better than another. I don't know that.
Do sorry, wait here. Have you where am I at? Oh, have you done any work on situations where journalists are the targets of misinformation, where they're being misled by advocacy groups posing as professional organizations, such as transgender medical care? There's GenSpect is one of many good examples of where
Right.
the actual organizations form to target the journalists.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh my God. Yes.
There's
Well,
also the with
so is,
abuse of head trauma. There's a bunch of defense attorneys that
yeah. Well, I haven't specifically worked with journalists, but I can certainly tell you how not to be fooled. And that is, or at least, protect yourself. And that is known as lateral reading. What that means is that if you come across a website and you don't know, what it is, or whether it's trustworthy, don't waste your time on the website because they're designed to make you believe them. Okay. Instead, open some other tabs on your browser and Google the name of that outfit. Go to Wikipedia, see if that outfit exists. And if you do that, then usually within seconds, you either find out no one knows what it is, which means it's unlikely to be a credible institution, or somebody says, haha, it's a fossil fuel funded, astroturfed climate thing. So that's the first thing. I do this all the time. If I get a website, somebody says, "Oh, you should look at this website. It's got good information." I never look at it. I just Google it to find out who's behind it. And you can always do that. And if there's nothing, then I know why would I trust it. And if it tells me who's behind it, then I can make my own judgment.
What do we do we're facing this in the US, I'm sure you've seen with the changes in government websites. How do we counteract or share facts when the government websites themselves are no longer accurate sources of
Yeah.
information? An example from today, the US government website says, for Americans 18 to 45, the leading cause of death is fentanyl overdose, which is just false.
Yeah, and I mean, first of all, it is grotesque and it's a tragedy and a travesty. So what do you do? Well, as it happens, I know a team in Berlin that has been downloading American websites and archiving them and preserving them ever since the election. And they have, I mean, terabytes of data. And as far as I know, they've archived the entire CDC from a time when it was actually, kind of like based on science. And now you just don't know. You have no idea. Is it quackery? Is it science? I mean, you can no longer trust any official government website, I'm afraid, because you just don't know. But people have been archiving it. I don't have the link handy right this moment, but
We've been
uh,
sharing a lot of those on our site, yeah.
yeah, it's
Um,
Henrik Schoenemann at Humboldt University is leading that effort, and it's amazing. Yeah.
I'm going to combine two other questions, and then this will probably have to be our last question since we're so close. And I'm sorry that we can't get to everyone's. Have you explored whether people who are devoutly religious are less likely to be able to examine truth status than people who are not part of organized religion? And even though it's not strictly the same, I'm going to combine that with a question about how you counter facts when and you've talked a little bit about this, when they've formed an identity around it, when they're part of a
Oh,
group,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that's because both of those are sort of related to one another in different ways.
Yes.
Even if they're
Yes.
not religious, there might be we see that in the United States with the polarization right now.
Course. Religion is a tricky thing because as a first approximation, very often the associations with acceptance of science are negative. So, in other words, the more religious people are, the less likely they are to believe in or to accept scientific evidence. However, it's not quite that simple because there are some situations where religion can be a very positive thing. So, for example, and then it totally depends on the particular faith. So, for example, this whole idea of stewardship for the planet is deeply ingrained in Christianity, and the Pope wrote an encyclica Lewandowsky several years ago, in which he came out saying, well, it's a Catholic duty or whatever, to protect the planet and to take climate change seriously. So I'm reluctant to be totally just one-sided on that because it is very complex. When it comes to identity, well, yes, if you become entwined in a belief that is part of your identity, like QAnon or something or whatever, it's extremely difficult to get people out of it. You're really talking about deprogramming cult members, basically, in the extreme case, or deprogramming terrorists who want to exit. But, it's a very complicated process, and you can't do it in 5 minutes. It can be done successfully, but it's a hugely involved and time-intensive process.
If you are you able to stay a little bit over if we do a couple more questions?
I have another meeting with one of my students, so I can tell them that I'm running over. Let me do
Okay,
that.
we can just, I didn't want to cut into your time. I just thought I would ask, there's only a few more questions here.
Yeah, go for it. I can do another 5 or so.
Okay, perfect. A question about the illusory truth effect. Does that work with repeating the truth over and over? Like if
Oh,
you're
yeah.
lie, I mean, just repeating the, I mean, we have the vaccines don't cause autism. The vaccines don't cause autism. Does repeating that over and over and over also have that effect?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And that is one of the really good reasons, important reasons to preach to the choir.
Okay.
The communicators think they don't have to talk to people who are on their side. That's wrong. You've got to preach to the choir over and over and over again, if
That's
only to make sure there still is a choir tomorrow. You got to hold on to
nice.
it. Yeah.
And how do we do inoculation? The pre-bunking, I think, is the common term for that, when we don't know what they're going to come up with next.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting point. Well, you see, all our debunking stuff was us, in a sense, not knowing what's coming up. But you always know ahead of time how they're going to do it. So, for example, in climate change,
Okay.
they're always going to cherry pick, right? They'll find a thermometer in Taiwan that is cooler today than it was last week. Ha ha ha, climate change is a hoax, right? Complete nonsense. You know this ahead of time. They will cherry pick one observation out of a million to make their point. They're not good faith actors. They're acting in bad faith, and this is how they do it. So let's play a game. What do you think is going to be the next cherry pick? Well, here's my candidates. I think they'll do this, that, and the other. So I think you can inoculate people against this. We've done it without knowing. Well, of course we knew because it was our experiment, but we developed the inoculation materials without knowing what was coming.
I noticed you mentioned cherry picking. I'm put this cherry picking. I'm going to put this into the chat. The flick model that Mark Hoofnagel came up with that's one of the 5
Yes.
key. How much does
Well, it's actually developed by John Cook, but never mind.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought that I've got misinformation there for me. I'll have to get that fixed.
Minor detail, but John Cook was my PhD student, so I want to give him some credit for that.
Okay, good. I'll have to fix that then because I actually wrote about that in something that hasn't been published yet, so I'll have to fix that. How do you is science and disinformation gaining with the new administration's moves? How much is what the new administration currently doing? Are they winning or are they going to win if they keep this up? Well,
Wow, that's
can't see the
anybody's
future.
guess.
I didn't mean to ask such a loaded question. I just mean like how is the misinformation that disinformation that they're promoting, is it having, how much is it moving the needle?
Oh, it is. It is moving the needle. Of course it is. It has to, because they have a whole system, an echo chamber. They have Fox News. I mean, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that watching Fox News kills you. During the pandemic, there's good evidence because people who watch Fox News tended not to isolate or wear masks, so they were more likely to get infected, and blah blah blah. You have these downstream consequences. This is definitely, absolutely moving the needle. There's no question about that. Now, how far is this going to go is anyone's guess, and that's a political question. It's ultimately all about politics. Will the Democrats put up resistance, in a meaningful way? Will the media become smarter? They sort of learned a little bit, but not nearly enough. Those are open questions. I have no idea. I
Well,
think I think this is perhaps interesting. I think that the events in America have been a great inoculation treatment for Europe because
glad we're the example.
at least there's a silver lining for us in just watching this unfold, and we say, whoa, 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 whoa. We don't want that here. So, well, certainly in Canada, I mean, Jesus, that, Canadians have never been more united, I think. It's very interesting to observe. And the same, by the way, in the UK. The pro-Trump extreme right in the UK is now fairly isolated all of a sudden. Yeah. So inoculation works.
I'll make this the last question because I know you're going to go.
Sure.
And again, I'm going to combine two questions. Someone asked, how do you respond to those who say, I do my own research? And I'm combining that with another question about comparing social media sources to legacy media sources, since I think a lot of people who say they do their own research either start or get influenced by social medias.
Sure. How do you deal with with difficulty? Because the moment somebody says, I'm doing my own research, you basically know that they do not know what research means. Otherwise, they would never claim this grand sense of entitlement that if they go on Google for 10 minutes, they know more about vaccines than medical scientists and more about climate change than climate scientists. And there's actually data on that. There is a small but significant number of people who do think they know more about vaccines and autism than doctors, and they know more about climate change than all the climate scientists. They're the ones who do their own research. They're extremely difficult to deal with. I think the best thing you can do is to sort of say, wow, that's really exciting. Have you thought of writing this up and submitting it to a journal? Um, and and then can I give you the link for Nature for the submission portal? That's what I tend to do. I have family like that. It's kind of like, oh wow, that's so exciting. I can't wait for this to be in print. Why don't you publish it? And that kind of, then it gets harder because then they have to say, oh, there's a conspiracy against me because, I'm so bright, no one else understands me. And then it becomes kind of like, everybody who listens will draw their own conclusions.
Right. Well, thank you very much to those who asked about sharing these links, including I'd like to get the link from you, Stephen, about the
Sure.
YouTube video that you weren't able to show us. We're going to
Yeah,
add the.
I'm happy to send you my slides. You can share them. That's
Okay,
fine.
I was going to ask about that as well. Okay, great.
Sure.
We'll try and put some of those links on the webinar page, and
All
I'll
right.
be putting together a tip sheet that will be coming out probably about a week and a half-ish from now. We'll include all the links in that as well, and some tips from this as well. Thank you
Okay.
so much, and thank you for letting us go over a little
You
bit. This
bet. Yeah,
has
I
been
gotta
fantastic.
go. My student is waiting. I'll see you
Yes,
later. Bye.
absolutely. Bye-bye.